Sawa. Okay, we're live on YouTube. We're going to give folks a couple more minutes, like 2 or 3 more minutes, and then I will start us off formally. We're recording and we're live on YouTube right now. So you can tell your friends to tell their friends. If they've not logged into this webinar, they can follow along on YouTube.
Your YouTube link is Baraza Media Lab, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let me find that.
Thanks everyone who has already joined. If you are now with us on this webinar, thank you for making the time to be here. We're going to give ourselves like 2 more minutes and then I'll start us off. All right. William Karibu, thank you for joining us. So I am going to just start us off right now. My name is Christine Mungai. I am a writer, journalist, and the lead curator at Baraza Media Lab. And this is the 4th edition of our 5-part series, which we are calling Future of Funeral, the Fate of Kenyan Media. We've had 3 amazing sessions so far. We've been having these sessions every other Tuesday, and this is our 4th one. And for this edition, we're going to be talking about journalists' lives matter. In our previous session, we talked to a number of digital strategists and YouTube creators who are doing, incredible, innovative things. But in this session, I want us to kind of shift gears and to appreciate that the work that we do has, real life consequences for the people who choose to do it, right? It's not all fun and games, but sometimes people's lives are on the line and the cost that we pay to do this work is very, very high. So today I am joined by a really, really esteemed panel. I'm so excited to have all the people who are here. I've worked with some of them. I admire all of them. I look up to all of them. And so I'm just going to quickly introduce the panel. We have Daniel Kalinaki, who's joining us from Kampala, Uganda. He is with Nation.Africa, formerly known as Nation Media Group. We have John Allan Namu, who is joining us from Nairobi. He is the founder of Africa Uncensored, broadcast journalist and investigative journalist. We also have William Olojanak, who is the chairman of the Kenya Correspondents Association. And each of these three people is going to join us a little later in our session as panelists, but our keynote speaker today is Nanjala Nyabola, a writer and political analyst, and an author of 2 books, one which is just launching in a couple of weeks. So we'll talk a little about that towards the end of our session. I'm super excited to be here and to have this conversation with all of us. So thank you again for making the time. So Nanjala, maybe you can start us off. I know you have some insights to share about the trends that you've been seeing around the kind of manipulation and harassment, overt and covert work that you're seeing that puts journalists' lives in danger, which is why we're talking about our lives mattering. And this really doesn't even have to be, physical danger of arrests or murder or anything like that, but even the psychological warfare that we are seeing being carried out with disinformation campaigns, propaganda, and everything that you've been seeing with trends around that. So for the next 10 to 15 minutes, Nanjala, you can take over and just take us through what the trends that you've been seeing, and particularly since you launched your first book, which I think was 2 years ago. I know that that book ended with the 2017 general election, but things have been happening around that and after that. So Nanjala, please.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. I feel like I have to start off by saying, just reaffirming that I am not a journalist, at least not in the traditional sense of the word. I'm a writer. I'm a person who thinks about the things that journalists do. And one of the things that's really gotten lost in the last couple of years, I would say, in terms of thinking about what journalists do and why journalists matter, is that people have lost sight of the amount of risk and the amount of personal risk, especially, but also professional risk that goes into taking on that mantle of becoming a journalist. I think that the lines have become a little bit blurred, and sometimes that's for the good. I think having more citizen journalists is actually for the good, having people who are present in their communities, documenting what's happening and amplifying key information is actually good for information, for the public information. But I think what has happened is that as powerful people, as politicians, have increasingly framed journalists as a threat and as something to be opposed, as a space to be controlled, we're increasingly seeing all of this ranging from outright violence, outright, killings, kidnapping. We're talking about arrests, harassment, intimidation, and we're talking about online harassment, online intimidation, all the way to just shutting journalists out from the public sphere, shutting the journalists out from political conversations. And so I think that it's important for people to go back to basics when thinking about the space for journalism and why these things matter and why these things are a big deal, because the journalist, and this is the argument I make in the book, is a pillar of the democratic process, that a well-informed polity, that a well-informed public is actually critical to the democratic process, that the point of journalism is about giving people the information that they need in order to pass through their social, political truths, and in order to make best decisions for everybody. And I think if there's anything that we've learned by watching the US election, by watching elections in India, by watching elections across Africa, is that a misinformed polity is one that puts itself in danger through its decision-making process. And so even as we talk about these examples of what trends are happening and what things are out there, I think it's important to give people a sense of orientation of why the risks exist and why these things are actually bad developments. On the digital space, I mean, as I set out in the book, the process of intimidating journalists online, misinformation online against journalists, is actually connected to the retreat of the traditional media and the role that the traditional media and the role that social media plays in the way in which information, political information, is developed and shared in Kenya. And so that is why when I start the genealogy, I start with the modern genealogy, not even the, the Moi era, the Kenyatta, the first era. I start with rattling a snake. If you rattle a snake, you can expect to get bitten. With that declaration from the Minister of the Interior, then Minister of the Interior, John Mishuki, and the idea that journalists are supposed to play nice with power, and when they don't play nice with power, then everything that power lobs against them is actually fair game. We've seen in the last year increasing use of legislation and the law in order to curtail public information. Some of these laws have been declared unconstitutional. 24 parts of the Computer Cybercrimes and Misuse Act were declared unconstitutional. Unfortunately, that was reversed at a superior court, and that case is still under appeal. We've seen increasing use of local and national sort of ordinances, laws, legislation in order to say that criticizing the state is actually an offense, which it shouldn't be. So a great example is what I like to emphasize to people is that every single law to date in Kenya that has been passed in order to try and address online security issues, safety issues, etc., has first been used against critics of the state, whether they are journalists, whether they self-identify as journalists, whether they self-identify as bloggers, whether they self-identify as content creators. The first swing is always at someone that has made power uncomfortable. And that is a worrying trend because there are legitimate threats out there. There are legitimate things, hacking, for example, doxing, online harassment, online assault. But these laws are not designed to address those things, and it reflects the preoccupations of power. And the preoccupations of power is to keep people uninformed. We've seen in Kenya, we've seen the use of hashtags against journalists. We've seen, so it kind of reflects the way in which people defend journalists. So when someone gets arrested, you have free XYZ, free XYZ. And the idea is not directly, but to undermine the argument that Wilson was doing is journalism, and he's in space in order to spread misinformation. And we do have people who are, aligned with certain camps within politics in order to advance specific information agendas. So it becomes very difficult to say categorically that what this person did, for example, it becomes very difficult to make declarations one way or the other because of just the way in which the background information is blurred. But overall, even if you take the personal identity of that person out of the table, the fact that institutions are spending money and paying people in order to manipulate that public conversation, and specifically harnessing that in order to tarnish the reputation of a specific critic. It's the most egregious example that I think we've seen worldwide in recent years has been against Rana Ayub. Rana Ayub is an Indian journalist. She's an Indian Muslim journalist in her hometown, New Delhi, but she also writes more broadly about what's happening with the internet and free speech in India and targeting against the Muslim minority. And the Muslim minority in India is still about 300 million people. Many online doxing attacks has been the subject of many online harassment campaigns. It's almost impossible for Rana to tweet anything without getting a wave of backlash against her. Most of it is identity-based. A lot of it is dismissive, a lot of threats. And in fact, she was one of the first people who pointed out the hypocrisy of the online controls that were put on Donald Trump's accounts. She was one of the first people to flag that what was happening online was kind of with Trump was kind of like a double standard. And so, yeah, we've seen that although in Africa, just give me 1 second.
Nanjala's internet, I think she needs to change her connection. But as she's doing that, Daniel, if I may ask, with what Nanjala has talked about, Nanjala, I can see your back. You are just changing your connection, right? You're muted right now, Nanjala.
I'm muted.
Yeah, there you go. But I
Okay.
just wanted to throw this Daniel's way, and he can answer once you're done with your with what you're presenting. Daniel, Nanjala has talked about these threats and this uncertainty and this environment of harassment being connected to the retreat of mainstream media or traditional journalism. I find it really intriguing that Nanjala has used the word retreat. I usually see the word decline being used. Decline sounds, quite inevitable, like you're standing on a slope and you can't help but slide down, right? But Nanjala, you've used the word retreat. And I'd like you, Daniel, to just think about that for a bit, and then I'll let you respond to that. Nanjala, you can unmute yourself and then continue.
The person who is muting me, I see you. So I'll just fast forward through that and say, so the next stage of what's happening after the online campaigns and the abuse of the legislative process, then you get targeted harassment and you get targeted campaigns against specific journalists. And I've mentioned Rana Ayub in India, but another case that's very interesting is Hopewell Chunono in Zimbabwe, who has been arrested twice in the last 2 months, I believe, for his online content, for tweets that are asking for accountability against the Zimbabwean state. And the interesting thing about Hopewell is that the legal framework under which his arrest was being conducted isn't very clear. It's not clear that he's being arrested under laws that exist. And in fact, what it seems is happening is that the architecture of the legal process is being built around his specific case. He's being treated much more harshly than people who have been accused of economic crimes. He's being treated much more harshly than people who have been accused of even violent crimes, being held in maximum security prison for things that he says online. And I think the upswell in the use of very harsh criminal penalties against online content is a reflection of how potent the online space is. Like, the government is scared, power is scared, and is trying to get some measure of power back against a space where they have very little control and very little understanding. Hopewell is an example of an extreme sort of the axe coming down very hard. But we have what is a slow progression in countries like Tanzania, where both the law was introduced to tax people, to fine people, to make people pay for $900 for a blogging license. In Tanzania, blogging license is almost as expensive as starting a newspaper. And then we have those laws being used around the election period in order to stifle free speech. And I'll give you an example. I was recently guest editing a special edition of a magazine, and it was very hard to get Tanzanians to write openly, because the climate of free speech, of criticism, has been so chilled in the last 2-3 years without a significant sort of pushback, especially from outsiders, right? We just kind of said, oh, this is weird, Tanzania, Magufuli is so weird, how strange. But the impact was actually seen in the election process. So it was very difficult to marshal, even though these atrocious things were happening against both opposition candidates and journalists and people who were documenting the violence against the opposition candidates, that it was difficult to get like a solid narrative, a solid story out of Tanzania. I suspect that we're going to see the same wave of sort of contracting the space for freedom of expression online in Kenya, in Somalia, certainly in Ethiopia with the upswell of violence in Tigray, certainly in Uganda as the election sort of comes closer. One thing I want to say before I wrap up, because I know I only have 10 minutes, is last week or week before last, the BBC issued guidelines for its journalists on what they can say and they can't say online. And it was very interesting, the language that was chosen by the Director General of the BBC, because it included statements like a ban on virtue signaling and a ban on showing their solidarity with specific causes. And the BBC was basically saying that they didn't want their journalists to be seen to be pontificating or to be taking a moral stance on public interest issues. A lot of BBC journalists have publicly and privately raised concerns about these guidelines, There's been an upswell of conversation online. And I think to me, it represents what's going to happen next. We've already seen legislatures in the United States, in the UK, and now also I think in Germany, people going into parliament and saying things like, we don't want to teach critical race theory. Critical race theory is an attack on our values as a country. We don't want to teach all of these progressive and especially Black oriented theoretical frameworks that are about 50, 60 years old, being held up as an example of eroding the integrity of the state, and now being extended in practice. Like the practice is, we want our journalists, we want our public facing organizations to stop publicly taking sides on issues. Now, the thing is, this seems like a small, well, it's not a small thing, at least as an academic, it's not a small thing, but it might seem like something that doesn't have a fundamental impact on how political information is created and disseminated, but it will, because what it will do is that what it does is it will chill the space for discourse and chill the space for conversation. The BBC is one of the largest media outfits in the world. If BBC journalists are not able to speak freely about things that they are passionate about, are not able to speak freely about ideas that are coming their way, intellectual ideas that are coming their way without being censored, without having pushback from the state, then they're going to stop doing that. And we're going to stop having this climate of learning and growing that has come from many, many years of activism and organizing and teaching. And I think overall, what we're going to see in the next couple of years is a backlash against what has been the slow success of the Black Lives Matter movement, the slow success of demands for more critical conversations about how our societies are organized. I think what we're going to see is a backlash against that, and a desire to return to this fictional idea of the good before, and the good the good structure of the societies that we had before. And I think that fictional that desire to return to a fictional before is going to have serious ramifications on the space that we have to do critical, insightful, and necessary journalism. So I'll leave you with those three thoughts. I think that in terms of connecting the digital and journalism and the threats against journalism, I think the things we pay attention is the climate of eroding trust, the climate of undermining truth, the climate of transforming information. And I think when we think about all of these things together, we see that journalists are more necessary now than ever. Protecting the space for journalism is more necessary now than ever. And the urgency, it's impossible to overstate the urgency of pushing back against some of these trends. Stop there.
Nanjala, thank you so much for that. That was really rich and insightful, and I was taking notes the whole time. I'm going to ask our audience today, if you're attending this webinar, there's a Q&A little box at the bottom of your Zoom window. So if you have questions for any of the panelists, just go ahead as we are talking. You can put in your questions or your comments there, and we'll be, weaving in your questions in the course of this conversation. So Daniel, just to respond to Nanjala's presentation, I had asked you to think about kind of the words that we use to describe this phenomenon that we are living in. The word decline is kind of like, it's natural, it's like gravity, right? But Nanjala has used the word retreat, which is quite a different way of framing it. What's your response to this?
Thank you, Kristen, for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. I feel a bit like the diversity.
The diversity hire.
Well, a lot of stuff from Nanjala, and I'm not entirely sure whether it's retreat or decline. I've always thought about it normatively as decline. Because retreat presupposes a very deliberate decision to scale back. And we would need to unpack that a little bit. What are you scaling back from? Is it scaling back on the areas that you cover? Is it scaling back just the size of your operation? Are you doing it for ideological reasons? Are you doing it for just practical economic considerations? I'm not entirely sure that I have straight off my head a very cogent response to that. But what I wanted to just kind of respond to is to basically make 3 points. The first is that from a media point of view, a lot of the stuff that we are saying, I think, is enforced by the shift in the economic fundamentals, as opposed to an ideological retreat, to use Nanjala's word, from the need to hold power accountable. I think media houses that find themselves vulnerable economically in societies that where the government is a major player, whether as an advertiser or as a determinant of who takes the economic surplus, then find that it's much harder for them to maybe challenge power the way that they did in the past. The second thing is that part of it is self-inflicted, that we probably took it for granted that our audiences appreciated the importance of quality journalism and kind of trustworthy reporting on the things that were happening around them. Many media houses and the industry generally, I think, didn't do enough in terms of media literacy, just to explain to people why it was important to have a relatively free and independent press, and why in societies that were building democratic institutions, you needed to build a culture alongside that of holding power accountable, of being the fly in the ointment to those in privileged positions. The third thing is that while we focus primarily on the media industry, I think the problem that we are dealing with is quite broader than that. I think the bigger problem is one of civil society, and I would even say democracy itself as we understand it. And here's why I say that. There have been attacks, well-publicized attacks on civil society in Uganda, in Kenya, in Tanzania, in pretty much many countries across the region, even in places like Europe and the United States. The interesting thing for me is that where you have civil society organizations that claim to be representing some kind of public interest, they're helping, whether it's widows, helping build boreholes, helping defend human rights, there's been very little effort by the beneficiaries to come out and defend and speak up for the civil society organizations. Whether that reflects the lack of impact of the work that they were doing, or just the inability of those communities to speak out and defend these civil society organizations, I am not sure. But my own sense is that when you put these things together into a composite, the image that emerges is that the democratic dividend that we took for granted after the end of the Cold War, and which we thought had materialized in the late 90s, early 2000s, has become really ritualistic. It is dictatorship practiced via democratic rituals. So you have free and fair elections every 5 years. You have media space that allows a little bit of noise without much critical shaking of the table. You have institutions that, whether they're governance or accountability institutions, but when you take it all apart, the will of the people and the consent of the governed is not always there or consistently there. So my own sense is that the media is a symptom of a much bigger crisis of democracy in pretty much the world.
Thank you so much for that. That was so interesting how you said that you are seeing dictatorship practiced through democratic rituals, right? It's quite ritualistic, but hollow on the inside, really doesn't have substance on the inside. I know that you connected this to economic considerations and to other kind of broader technological changes that are happening anyway, right? But I just want to ask you, before I move this to John Allen, what do you think in this context is a low-hanging fruit that media organizations can latch onto now in this very difficult kind of psychological context? Maybe another way to ask it is, what in your view is a need among the audience that has been consistently unmet? This is a question that I've asked like in previous editions of this series, and we've had various answers, but I really want to hear it from your perspective. What do you think is something that has consistently been unmet? You've talked about taking for granted that the audience understands or cares or is on board with this free press idea, right?
That's an excellent question. And in a way, the answer is built within the problem, because the media industry is going from a place where we relied, the guys that, paid for our dinner weren't the guys that we tend to be representing. The advertisers paid our bills while we claim to be representing the interests of the people, right? I think the shakeup of the economic fundamentals in a manner that means that those that survive will have to rely on, at least for a large part of their income, income from the audience, from the people that they claim to be serving, I think is very democratizing, in the sense that if you're relevant, you will have enough people giving you their money for the stuff that you do. And it takes this elephant out of the room, and if you're not relevant, you lose your shot, but you also become more responsive to your customers, because if you then have to increase the quality of your journalism, you need to increase the transparency of your decision making, you need to be more accountable, and to be seen to be more accountable, you need to be more professional, you need to be fairer, you need to listen more, right? You need to build communities around you rather than divide. So I think it's very difficult, and many are going to fall by the wayside, but I'm pretty optimistic that those that survive, those that get out at the end of the tunnel, will be leaner, more responsive, more accountable, and they will really reflect the, I think, worldview and the aspirations of the people that will be paying for that content.
Well, that was a really, really good answer to a very difficult question, complex question, right? But I want to just shift this over to John Allen, because tying together what Daniel and Nanjala have said so far, I'd like to hear your views from where you stand. You've made your name as an investigative journalist, longtime broadcast journalist, recognizable on our screens, before taking the plunge to start up Africa Uncensored. And journalism culture in this part of the world, I would say, is kind of ambivalent. Daniel has alluded to this, that we sort of switch between critical reporting, right, holding truth to account or speaking truth to power, and also in a way kind of being compliant at the same time. What Nanjala has talked about, kind of playing ball, and if you choose not to play ball, then you know what you're signing yourself up for, right? So there's this kind of tension between critical reporting and pandering sometimes, yeah? How do you see that tension playing out in your work? And what's the impact of this as perhaps you receive lukewarm support or ambivalent support for stories that you've done, even if you think that this is something that is really important, that is a serious story that matters a lot, but when you do it, at the end of the day, it's kind of mixed reviews or ambivalent or lukewarm support for the work that you do, because this tension is playing out. John Allen.
Okay. Well, that's a It's a difficult question to answer, so I'll try my best based on my experience, at least my point of view. I think the first part of your question about well, I guess the ambivalence, right, of both audiences and the people that we report about. I think this issue goes back even further than the current challenges that we're facing, right? And it's really a matter of focus from my point of view, where the media focuses its time and its attention, and what the result of that is. And as Daniel said, because different people were paying for the work, then the priorities were kind of shaped by that in a sense. Whatever a journalist on the ground would feel, that there were always certain forces that shaped the kind of narratives that we would then take and pursue. And let me put it simply. Our focus has always been on the powerful, on the elite, on the people who make their way through society far easier than the majority of the members of the public. And that critical mass, having been ignored for such a long time, right, and not mattering for such a long time, then now becomes the focal point for a media that's scrambling to figure out what's going to happen once advertising, etc., falls as a pillar. That's why I think there's a lot of ambivalence, because the reporting about the critical mass has been incidental, right? And many times it's been about how the power is projected upon these people, not so much about their own lived experience. And in that way, then it becomes inauthentic over a period of time. And I'm not saying that it has happened all the time, or even some of the times, but of the problem of the part of the wider, the world over time, right? Again, to what Daniel was saying, because that attention has not been, and this is my own interpretation of what Daniel was saying, because that attention has not been paid over time, then it becomes very difficult for you to be an authentic voice for, right, for the people, for the public interest, for the prurient interest, because you've never done this before. It's not part of your DNA. Yeah. So our experience has been in trying to move that needle more towards public interest in issues, whether or not they've been pursued traditionally as important. That's been our struggle for the past couple of years. And in some ways we've been successful, in other ways we've not. And I think it's a factor of two things. One, if you're trying to change a culture, even of viewership, even of audiences' participation in your work, then it'll take a much longer time than you'd expect. The learning curve for everybody will be a lot longer than you'd want. But secondly, it's also I think a bias coming from my old life, being a journalist for X amount of years within traditional media setups, where that framing of what's important, what's interesting, what moves and what impacts people becomes part of the way you report. And you forget that you must pay attention to how engaged people are with a specific subject, not just at that at that level, but deeper, just mine a little deeper and try and understand why people would engage with certain issues. I'll give you a final example before I stop. For us, we've had a very serious challenge trying to understand how to get more female and I recognize that that's part of my own sort of institution, that didn't really care so much for those kinds of nuances in the way you report, unless it was a very, very clearly male or female issue, right? Because a lot of us don't understand something like that, then it becomes very difficult for us to interpret issues that we or would matter or would resonate with certain parts of our audiences. So the lesson here for me in terms of the ambivalence is not so much, it's not just that it's a matter of a changing culture or the fact that people have been ignored. It's also a lesson in how to listen, right? How to really listen for what's important and why it's important. And that informs both the content that you go after, as well as the way the content is interpreted, whether you're going to do, in simple terms, like a short video, or you're going to do a blog or a podcast, at that level, and even deeper, what things are you going to be able to include in them? To the end of my rambling, I think it's really just, how do I put this in a way that doesn't water down what's been said before me? It's really a very big and fundamental change in the way we think as journalists and as an institution, because now the most important asset or skill set is just the ability to listen, which you take for granted as one of the things that all journalists know and understand how to do. But at an institutional level, being able to listen is really the one thing that's going to be able to change the fortunes of an industry and get more people more actively engaged. And I could go on about this, but yeah, I think I'll stop there.
John Allen, thank you so much for that. You've talked about this moment being a lesson on how to listen. And this just ties in with a comment that has come in our chat window. Elijah Kisembo, as actually before you started speaking, he had already sent in this comment, and then you kind of corroborated it. He said that there seems to have been no expectation from the masses, basically to include their perspective, right? And then he goes on to say critical masses were ignored, and so they also ignored the media, right? It's really powerful how you say that for us to be in this moment is a chance to actually listen, right? To actually listen and not to carry over what we know to be true or to be right, but actually to listen to the people that we claim to represent. As Daniel has said, that there is an opportunity to make that link more direct, that we don't have to go through this advertising model to survive as businesses, right? Or to survive as institutions. But do you think that there is space for a publicly funded media model in that way, rather than as opposed to advertiser model, or what is also emerging, which is like donor funded, right? Where we have donors who support sections of newspapers or of the media.
Yes, I think there's a very big opportunity, and most people will come at this from the point of view of, oh, Africans don't have money to spare, et cetera, et cetera. But why not? I mean, we spare money for the things and the causes that we think are important. Why not journalism, right? And I'll give you an example that perhaps people didn't notice as being fairly important with respect to your question, right? So there's a guy called A-Star, right? He has a website called, I think, Cleaning the Airwaves, and he's been running like a series of interviews, etc., with artists going in, mining into their past, and at the bottom of that there's a link that asks people to support his work. Why I think that's an important example is that even with content like that, that's not per se hard-hitting investigative, or critical public interest journalism. There's a resonance, right, with the public, and they'd be willing and interested to pay for it. So I don't think that it's a matter of money, people not. For me, was an example of the response from the community that he's been able to build around his content, supporting his work. That's the onus that we all have as journalists. Speaking to the donor-led model, because that's something that we've been a part of as Africa Uncensored. I think it's got a shelf life, and I'll say this without even knowing what the future will be. But my own instinct about it is that it has a shelf life, because in as much as some of these initiatives and some of the support, a lot of the support is much closer to the concerns that the public has, in that they are always trying to address certain issues or certain problems, and therefore they see journalism in that way as assisting in the solving of these issues. Why, and perhaps this is just my view, why NGOs, civil society has not been as robust as it should have been over the recent past, is that in some quarters, it doesn't feel like it's led by the people who are wearing the shoes that pinches, right? The money, the revenue, the even the way everything is framed feels fairly, above or ignorant or aloof to the concerns of the public. You see this in Kenya through the emergence of social justice centers versus traditional, civil society organizations, and how social justice centers now represent, perhaps in a much more authentic, if not underfunded way, a voice that we haven't heard for a long time, right? And so it would follow then that the people that civil society organizations are supported by, and I include myself in this, would then perhaps be affected by some of the stink of not feeling that authentic. I haven't really crystallized this beyond my own understanding and my own feelings about this, but I think that there's something there. And that ambivalence that we had spoken about, in the first question, also stems from things like that, right? And so publicly funded journalism would be a huge cure to this. And I've argued that not only should publicly funded journalism be a very big part of the media, enterprise in Africa, but public broadcasters themselves should become, or should, make a return as very robust holders or communicators of the public interest. But then now that's a bigger question about the kind of democracies that we are in, and whether those kinds of voices or institutions can be allowed to flourish.
Thank you so much for that. Nanjala has a response to that. I knew you would have a response, Nanjala.
I don't have a response to that. I have something to say that is connected to that.
Yes,
not a response to that. No, I wanted to just jump in because there was an example that really stood out for me of what John Allen is saying, which is there's a guy, I think in Seattle or somewhere in Washington State, who noticed that what happened in the States is that the local newspapers got bought by big national conglomerates, and then the big national conglomerates start cutting jobs, and then the small local newspapers disappear. So you see these stories about this one woman who ran the entire local newspaper by herself and then got fired because she criticized her owner and things like that. So what this guy did is he started a local newsletter, and instead of facing a national audience, he started by facing his 400 people, an audience of 400 people, and having the news sort of be catered to them. So there's one or two sort of big national stories that are mostly purchased from the wires, but then it's really mostly information about what's happening in the local community. And I found that to be a very interesting and stimulating example, because I think one of the challenges that we have in Kenya is that we started with national newspapers. We started with national newspapers. We started with this whole idea of national broadcasting, of facing the entire nation. And then, you go into this phase of the one-party state where the media becomes part of this quote unquote nation building project. And the discourse of the nation building projects co-opts everything. Everything becomes oriented towards the political agenda of whoever has power, or this very vaguely defined normative idea of patriotism, that what is in the big nebulous national interest. But maybe to add on to what John Allen is saying, maybe people just want to be informed and make those normative decisions about nation building and being part of patriotic and other, make those decisions for themselves. Would thinking about the role of media in this way open up space for hyper local news in Kenya that is publicly funded because people can see how it directly connects to their lived experiences? I think about all of the pamphlets and stuff that you can buy at the Inamas in River Road, sort of downtown, that people are doing this. There are people who are printing, they go and they take the A3 paper and they print it out at a local photocopying place, fold it in half and then sell 10, 20 bob. Would thinking about news in this hyper-local way allow us to build a much more sustainable way of thinking about information? Because I think what's gotten lost in Kenya for me is also that, is this, yes, there is a public interest function in journalism, and it is absolutely paramount that the public interest function remains on the table. But also there is an information function, that people want information they can use. Raila versus Uhuru is not information they can use. BBI is not information they can use. Who is my MCA and what have they been up to in the last 3 weeks is information I can use, because then I can make the decision about, whose fault is it that the sewer line that has burst, 3 weeks ago hasn't been fixed? Whose fault is it that the matatus start making noise outside the bus stop at 4 a.m, and even though we have noise ordinances? So these are some of the things, that the conversations that I found to be super interesting, to John Allen's point about how do we reconcile these bigger meta functions of public information, of the media, to this completely dynamic, changing ecosystem.
Thank you so much for that, Nanjala, because you began the thought that I was going to direct to William Olojanak, who is the chairman of the Kenyan Correspondents Association, talking about the tension between kind of national narratives and local realities, right? So William, I know that speaking about newspaper news gathering, let me call it that, something that many people may not appreciate is just how much of newspaper news gathering is done by correspondents, who are essentially, they don't receive a monthly salary, but instead depend on short-term contracts, and often are just paid for the pieces that get published. That this is actually the structural condition of newspaper making in this region, is dependent so much on local correspondence. There's a lot of financial and economic insecurity in this structure, and I'd like you to speak on that. What do you think the impact of these employment structures are on the ability of good stories to be told consistently, especially from that local perspective? William, can you hear me? There you go. Okay.
I can hear you.
Okay, cool.
I can hear you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me to this space. And the question you're asking is something that has been discussed within the media sector for a while. And of course, other people outside the media do not understand that structural, problem. They don't. And even when you're talking about even some people within the media do not understand that structural problem.
Yeah, it's not something that's well known or well appreciated.
Yes, it's not very well appreciated. But what there is that research has established, and the last research that was done, and which remains fairly, credible, was about 2002 by African Women and Child Features Service, and with the support of Friedrich Ebert Foundation or Stifter, was that correspondents contribute about 70 to 80% of daily media content, and under conditions that are not necessarily facilitative, because they are thrown out there, they're in the rural areas, and every day they're supposed to struggle to raise content for the national media. And the national media that will choose what they will publish from them. So the whole day you can struggle and raise, 2-3 stories. I've been a correspondent my whole life. Anyway, I haven't sat in the newsroom and I've resisted that idea, although I've started newspapers myself and possibly, I've done stuff for all the national newspapers, and I've the experience over the years, and I know that you can raise 5 stories per day, and there can be demands on you. And then out of these 5 stories, and you struggle, there's no facilitation, you end up with either 2 of them, and they can be briefs. And then there's no automatic thing about paying you. Somebody has got to be diligent enough to be measuring it with a ruler, and during, when we started in the 90s, we didn't have the luxury of technology. We were using the telephone booth. So you'd be lining up at the next telephone booth near the post office, and a Kopiteka in Nairobi is telling you to wait for 4 hours, So you are hanging out there. I can give you my own experience. I had a telephone booth. I was reporting for Nation from Migori and later The Standard. And there's a telephone booth across the road near the post office. I'm running a small kiosk. And my office assistant is actually a tailor who is having her, doing her thing near the telephone booth. So when it rings, they say, Janak, somebody wants you, So you've got to cross the road and go and answer the telephone call from the editor in Nairobi or the bureau chief in Kisumu, and even during that time, the demands were huge, because an editor will ask you to say, how did you miss this story? Let me just give you a quick example. All of you know about the story of the Legio Maria. The Legio Maria sect. And, recently you saw how they were fighting. I started my journalism career around the time when Legio Maria, the Messiah died, 1991. Now, a senior editor at the Nation called me through my telephone booth, that was the office, and asked me to get the story of this Legio Maria guy who is expected to rise from the dead. And he has no idea that the Legio Maria guy and the body that has been moved from Kisumu is 70 kilometers on a rough road from where I am. Now, they want you to do that story just now. I tell him, look, and many of us cannot do that. Many of the journalists couldn't do that. You'll probably struggle. So in that case, and you go to a place called Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is 70 or more kilometers away on a road that has no vehicle. And if you are likely to get a vehicle, it is one way that day. So it has been difficult. And even now with technology, technology has given us a chance to raise more stories, develop more content across board. But the problem is there is no opportunity for all those stories to be published. Because look, we are talking even about a new constitution, devolved system of government. Has the media devolved? Has the media created space for all the kind of stories that should come from all the 47 counties? Nation has 2 pages for all the 47 counties, a brief here, a brief there, and some of them are mundane stories, the Standard and all the others. So that is how it is. So you will find, let me give you the example. When I was at Nation, we are 70 of us. All of us from different parts of the country are supposed to file a story. And for 3 or 4 hours, because you are waiting for the Kopiteka to tell you are next, you can't do anything else, even the whole day. And by 3 o'clock, it is press time. So they may not even accept your story, or if they are willing to take your story, the possibility that it will be killed is much, much greater. Yeah, because there will be no space. So that has been the structural problem. And what we now have is that even with the technology, that has not changed. And now we are talking about COVID, and COVID creating a huge change, a huge paradigm shift, because the mainstream media, the main media that we are talking about as national, are largely elitist. They are not interested in the village news. So if I heard you talk about the MCA, was it you or Nanjala or you talking about the MCA? You can't give the nation or the standard a story about the MCA unless there's something dramatic about it. So that situation remains, and therefore, even as we are talking about the media being in service of the public, there are huge issues around that will remain unresolved. And as we speak now, I think there's going to be quite some hemorrhage within the media sector. Where will the correspondents? The correspondents are virtually all out of the newsroom now because of COVID. Since March, many have been paid. So what does that mean? Many of them have been sitting at home because on COVID, the information has been top down with Mutahi Kagwe shouting every 4 o'clock about figures and his team. So what has happened from the rural areas? Have you seen credible stories from the rural areas about COVID? That has not been happening. So what I would say in short, therefore, is that correspondents contribute a lot of stories. And indeed, if they were to stop, then probably the media sector would not even have stories to run. But they don't have enough space for all the stories they generate. And this has given us quite some headache, and the advocacy around some of these issues have not been easy.
Thank you so much, Janak, for that. I've just been listening as you've been talking, and a question has come into my mind, and Daniel or John Allen or Nanjala can take this. Janak is talking about this strange dichotomy between a structure that depends so much on local correspondence to produce copy, but the same structure really doesn't care that much about what they're saying. Do you get that sense that there's a demand for news, but that demand is not actually, it's not deeply rooted, right? It's that you produce copy, but no one actually cares about what you're saying. What Janak has said, that an MCA is never news unless he is locked out of his office or some dramatic thing happens, right? I don't know if you picked up that from what Janak was talking about, this strange kind of surface, superficial interest, but that is not actually, it's not deeply rooted, and in some ways it's not actually genuine. Maybe there's a different way to frame that, but I don't know what your response to that would be. I'm seeing, Daniel, you're really thinking about this. Are our newsroom sweatshops, are they information sweatshops where we just produce copy, but we really don't care about the, I mean, that sounds like a sweatshop model to me.
I think you're trying to get me into trouble. I'm the only guy on the panel with people in the provinces sending copy. Look, I'll say two things to that. The first is, and I think Nyabola kind of hinted on it, a national publication. You have national publications or broadcasters in societies that don't have enough national and enough local. So the story of the MCA is super relevant to the guy in Kisumu or Machakos, wherever the MCA is, but there's probably not big enough of an economy there for a super local media operation to thrive. So the ideal is local news. Local news is very important, and the ideal is that you find a model that allows the growth of local media houses, and maybe social media can help, so that the national titles, as it were, then deal with the macro, with the superstructure. And the story of the MCA will only get there if there's something, unique about it. They've discovered a cure for COVID, or they've done something that's really out of the ordinary. The other thing, to be a bit kind of callous about it, is that because there's just a lot of this news, it becomes a quantity game rather than a quality game. So it's pure economics. If supply exceeds demand, then the price is going to fall. And unfortunately, that's the nature of things, that if there is 400 stories competing for 20 slots, then the value of that news is going to go down, and then vice versa. But that's a very
why do you think this hasn't changed with digital?
I actually think it
seems like yeah.
I have seen, and I'm not sure if this is true, I need to look carefully in the other markets that we operate, but I've seen the emergence of super local media operations, be it on Facebook, be it on Twitter, that are just zooming in and covering a very specific town or village, sometimes run by correspondents who also file for national titles. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And they will have small, very loyal, very committed audiences, but will probably struggle to be economically viable in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Janak, just one last question to you before I ask us all our final question. So this is the second last question of today. There's a trend that we've seen in the context of devolution, as many leading journalists or even people who have been able to struggle through as local correspondents, because of devolution, there's this new demand for communications officers within the county government structures. What would you say about this trend of that being kind of like natural? Is it a natural progression for a local correspondent? Do you see a lot of county government offices absorbing good journalists on the grassroots? And what do you think is the impact of this with regard to the public interest? Or you don't think it's something that that is problematic in any way?
I normally work around media and governance issues a lot, and I've been privileged to be part of the struggle for a lot of changes in this country, including the constitution. So I'm one of those people who are very passionate about devolution, and I've worked on devolution from 2012, or let me say immediately the constitution was promulgated, and then we had the devolved system in 2013. Now we have 2 books on devolution, and we have had struggles around the benefits of devolution to journalists directly and what is emerging. On the face of it, certainly, devolution has created opportunities for correspondence in a manner that probably would not have been possible before. Not just in terms of the directors of information, and one of them unfortunately has just died in Homa Bay. Juma Luoch, who was previously with the Nation and Royal Media, succumbed to COVID yesterday, was the director of information at the Homa Bay County government. But then we are just within the communications director's office, there are many opportunities, and journalists have been employed there. Within the county assembly, journalists, and between 2013 and now, this has given many journalists who never had a chance to have like a 6-figure salary. Many of them are earning over 100,000. Journalists, okay, fine, look. And at KCA, we normally say we need to safeguard devolution, if nothing else, but because it has provided jobs for some of our people, and of course it is generating more news. But then it also bothers us that a number of the journalists who have been employed, who have crossed over and are now employed at the county communication offices and so on, some of them suddenly are fairly, antagonistic to their colleagues who are in the field. And this is because of the nature of the political, those offices are political. You are not interviewed merely because you need a job. There must be somebody else who tapped you from somewhere and said you could easily be here, because those are political. If, for example, you are the county director of information, you are basically like the governor's PRO. So you must be within the political framework that favors him, and therefore the kind of news you churn must speak to what his interests are. So we have had difficulties across, and we have engaged the governors and communication officers. We have also engaged the CRA, Communications Authority, in terms of the difficulties that are arising between those who are managing the communication structures at the county government offices, both at the assembly and also at the governor's level. And unfortunately, what we see is that there's hostility at that level. The other emerging problem is that counties have become very, very huge power bases. Economic influence, social influence, political influence. And now, most of the journalists, and we have more journalists now at the counties than we had, when we started. Can you imagine, for example, that Nyanza was manned by One Nation correspondent or Standard in the 90s? Right now, every town has about 20 journalists and maybe 3-4 radio stations. Now, the problem is that within the county governments and the competing political and economic interests, the journalists are split into different camps. There are journalists who are favored by the governor and the communications team, who may even have a budget for the ones that are favored. Then the others that are writing critical stories that we have been talking about in terms of public interest are then put at a different corner. So they can either be denied certain favors, they can be denied stories, or at worst, goons can be set on them. See that? Now, what happens therefore is that when we have heightened political contests, like right now, between now BBI and 2022, the journalists are already taking up certain positions, including consultancy, you can call it consultancy for social media postings and influencing. If the governor's rival can pay you 100,000 to do influencing within the next 2-3 months, you see what is happening. So then what is emerging therefore is that we are treating this nation to very false media narratives, both on social media and even on the legacy media. We have had situations where some of the communication officers who are in the newsroom or who have influenced the national media are posting stories that are targeted. I mean, they can ignore you here and get a story posted and run favorable to the governor. So the situation is extremely difficult, and therefore I would like to say that in response to that question, there are huge difficulties around in the counties. There are opportunities for more stories, fine, opportunities for employment, but certainly it is emerging as an area where, in terms of safety and security of journalists, we have a huge problem, and we as KCA are in the next 6 months or 8 months, we are running a safety and security training to try to get the journalists to respond to that kind of challenge.
Thank you so much for that response. I'm just going to now shift gears as we come to a close and ask John Allan, Daniel, and Nanjala. This has been a heavy discussion, and what is emerging is that, there are big structural forces that we are dealing with. And then there's our little part to play of the commitments that we've made to be the people that we are, who tell stories, who do the kind of work that we do, which is often quite difficult. And even sometimes in the context of this broader kind of misinformation and psychological warfare, you don't even get that small emotional reward of knowing that you spoke the truth and it made a difference. Because, Jonal, I don't know if you remember us having this conversation sometime of you can even break an important story only to see that story being appropriated by powerful political forces down the line, and they use your exact narratives redeem themselves, right? As talking points. So I just want to ask our other three panelists, how do you find joy in the struggle? What are your practices for cultivating joy? What are the ways that you stay sane? Daniel is laughing because, Daniel, why are you laughing? What are some of your practices, small or big, to find joy in this? Because for me, I think if there's no joy, then there's no point of doing this work, because it will drive you into the ground. Maybe we can start with John Allen. Tell me, how do you find joy in this, and what are your practices for cultivating joy? I use the word cultivating deliberately instead of finding, because finding presumes that joy is just there, ready to be harvested. But cultivating means that it's kind of a daily practice of nurturing this part of you that stays hopeful, that stays alive, that practices joy and hope.
When we had that conversation, I still haven't found a very succinct answer. So the short answer is, I don't know. The long answer is that I'm working on it, and this is what I've been doing. So I've been trying to find sort of like little spots of inspiration from authors and writers of, especially female writers of a Kenyan extraction, whose literature I found very refreshing, very inspiring, and stuff like that. And what that's done is that it's helped me relieve, it's helped me sort of like find some respite or relief in fiction, right? It's helped me find respite in fiction, and just dive into that world and be able to come out and admire the artfulness with which people write, and like I said, of late I've been very, very heavily invested in reading from Kenyan female authors. The other thing that has nothing to do with journalism is that I kickbox, right? And so in a very literal sense, I'm able to work out my problems on something else. But in terms of the journalism, I think my way of cultivating joy is in seeing the learning curve of some of the people who now work with me become a little less steep. Seeing that growth is really inspiring, and for me, and it reminds me of a time in my career that I was kind of going through that at the beginning of, and it also inspires me to learn more as I go forward. So yeah, not really a lot to do with the actual work, but these are the things that have helped me cope and remind myself that there actually is it's a profession worth being part of.
I like your answer: fiction, kickboxing, and teaching someone else.
Yeah.
Kickboxing especially. Daniel, what would you say are your practices for cultivating joy? Is there joy in your life, Daniel?
Well, the sound of a bottle of dry red wine being popped open has never failed to cheer people. But I think I would say, after many years around the block, I find pleasure in kind of working with younger journalists, in seeing them, especially with the new ways of storytelling, kind of pushing them out to be braver, to do things differently, to be better than us. I think that's kind of heartwarming. The other thing, I think, just in terms of managing expectations is, and you get this with experience and with old age, is that society doesn't change. The pace of social change is more glacial than kind of a sprint. When you're younger, you think you will break a story, force a resignation, topple governments, cause wars, end wars, bring world peace. When you're older, you realize that some of the things you do today will probably pay off many, many years to come. Some things will not even pay off, but that's fine. The important thing is that you have done your bit, and that other people who come after you will hopefully continue to build on that tradition. So it's about being humble and also finding things that, good books, finding self-care. Self-care is really important for journalists, and having a life outside the newsroom, I think, and being part of the community that you live in. I find that quite useful. Otherwise, spending all your time with journalists worried about when the next paycheck is going to come with red wine is not a very good combination.
I like that answer, Daniel. Nanjala, what are your practices for cultivating joy? Even if you're not going to answer from like the newsroom perspective, but still in the work that you do, which is as a writer, what would you say your practices are?
I was just cackling at Daniel's answer. So you caught me mid-cackle. Yeah, like, I'm gonna keep my camera off because my internet's being funny, but I think that the most important thing for me has been finding joy in the work of itself. So I like writing, and I know now the trend is for people to go online and talk about how writing is awful and everything is miserable, but I like writing and I enjoy it, and I like trying new types of writing, and I like experimenting with form, experimenting with platforms, experimenting with content. So to find joy in the work and in growing in the work, for me is also quite good. I don't kickbox, but I do run, and that's also quite good for staying balanced. And I think it's Daniel has said something that's really important, and I think it's really important to reiterate. Social change is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And we have to pace ourselves and realize that even if the change doesn't come with us or with our generation, setting the next generation up to have better outcomes than we did is important and is worthy and is worthy and is worthwhile. And I think that we have to find satisfaction in that we have made it easier, just like the people who went before us made it easier for us in their own ways. We have to make it easier for the next generation and take joy and pride in knowing that they won't have to go through some of the challenges that we face. I think the combination of that, there's no red wine involved, Daniel, but there is endorphins and finding joy in the practice. I think helps a lot.
Thank you so much, Nanjala, for that answer. And we've come to the end of our time together. Every time I do one edition of this series, I always feel really energized. And moderating is not easy, but for some reason, this series has not tired me out. I always leave the session feeling lighter, feeling happier, having been in the presence of such an esteemed panel enriches and energizes me. So thank you so much for honoring my invitation to be here, for sharing your insights and your experiences. I really don't take it for granted. Thank you as well for all our attendees on our webinar today, plus the people who are following along on YouTube, and for the side conversations that people are having on Twitter. I can see all of you. But thank you for that. Our next session is in 2 weeks' time. We're going to be publicizing this on our social media handles, so you can follow us on all our channels, Baraza Media Lab. And to be honest, this has left me thinking of what Daniel has said about just doing your part, right? Not thinking that you're going to be the one who will bring world peace, in his words. But just to realize that there's that level of having to pace yourself through this. And to be honest, that idea that you can change the world is a very individualistic idea that comes from that way of looking at the world as you at the center of it. It's an individualistic way of looking at the world. And instead, I'd encourage all of us to realize that that individualism actually keeps us small and weak, and it holds the status quo and vested interests in place, because the more you learn about the powerful structures that that control and influence what we are seeing, the injustice that we are seeing, the more despairing and depressed you'll be, right? But if you see yourself as just a bridge, right? That all you are is a bridge. You're not, the solution doesn't begin and end with you, but it just ends, it depends on us doing our little bit and not falling into the trap of thinking that if a full solution doesn't seem possible in your lifetime, then it's not worth trying. And that's you know, the lie of individualism, that if we don't see ourselves as part of a bigger story, then we end up feeling small and powerless because of the limits to our time, our resources and skills. Yeah. So I'll leave us with that. Think of yourself as a bridge, and don't get caught up into thinking that that if you don't see the full story or the full solution or the full answer, then it's not worth trying to get your part of the answer. It is worth it. It is worth it. So I'm going to keep this webinar room open for a few more minutes, for like 1 or 2 minutes. But our attendees are free to leave at this point. My last announcement is this, that for everyone who has registered on Zoom and has attended on Zoom, we're going to have a small gift for you in your email by the end of today. And you can feel free to share that with your family, friends, followers, on your socials and elsewhere. It's not wine, Alea, it's not wine. I've seen your question. But you know, it's digital swag, because that's how we do here at Baraza Media Lab. Again, thank you so much. I'm going to keep this room open so that we can quickly answer anything that's on the chat that needs to be answered. But you're free to leave and to share this recording on YouTube. Elijah, this is on YouTube already. I'm going to just put the link here for everyone, for all panelists and attendees, so that you can have the YouTube link. Asanteni sana, and see you again in a fortnight. Here is the link to the YouTube in case you need it. It's in the chat window. You can go ahead and grab that link, post it on your socials, share it with someone you think would benefit from this. But this has been really, really enriching. Thank you so much. Thank you too to our Baraza team that has been working behind the scenes to take care of the tech part of this. We appreciate you and we love you for the work that you do. Thank you, Alamin, for joining us. I see you. Thank you for being here. Shout out as well to David Oyuke. Thank you as a former panelist that you made the time to be here as an attendee. Thank you so much for that. So the link is there on the chat window. You can go ahead and share it. Wait for your little gift in your email that's coming up by 6 or 7 p.m. today.